Okay.
And let's see. That should
All right,
do it.
thank you.
We're advancing.
Very good. Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Colleen Sawyer, and after all those lovely words that David said about me, I'm really happy to be here. I love doing presentations at the Veterans Museum. This is like the best group of people to work with. Mike is so helpful. I am not techie, and he always makes me look way better than I am. Yeah, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful, warm and welcoming place to listen to a presentation and to give a presentation. So this is my favorite place in Broomfield. So just a little bit, I have to put a little disclaimer. This is quite a lengthy talk, longer than I usually do. But I'm talking about Eleanor Roosevelt, and it's so important that, and the work that she did was so important that I just didn't want to leave anything out. So bear with me, because it does get a little bit long, but I'll try to make it as interesting as I can. So, as the wife of President Franklin Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt was First Lady of the country. Together they took the country through the Depression and into World War II. She had led a difficult life defined by conflict and disappointment, but she had a keen sense of duty and a vision for a better world. She supported FDR's New Deal programs, and she was his legs, traveling all over the United States and Europe, promoting his causes and political agenda. She wrote a daily newspaper column called My Day. Eleanor spoke with self-confidence, authority, and independence. She believed in the equality of all people and earned the respect of people everywhere by being a political workhorse and a woman of courage and grace and fierce tenacity. But what I'm going to talk about today is not about Eleanor and Franklin. This is what happened after Franklin died and Eleanor was on her own. After his death in 1945, Eleanor found herself with more time to champion her own personal causes. She continued to travel and speak, contributed articles to magazines, and made television appearances. She established her reputation as a compassionate, thoughtful public figure who was willing to engage directly with the public and advocate for civil rights, women's rights, and humanitarianism. She had her enemies, especially William F. Buckley Jr. and the New Right, but most of the country loved her. Some felt she was too outspoken, too liberal, and poorly prepared in foreign policy to understand the problems of the rest of the world and the United States' place in global affairs. But she had real goodwill for all. The United States did not join the League of Nations in the 1920s, much to the dismay of President Woodrow Wilson. In 1941, FDR saw the Nazi violations of civil rights and advocated for the four freedoms: freedom from repression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. His philosophy led to the idea of a worldwide peacekeeping organization, and Roosevelt became a strong proponent of forming the United Nations. After his death and the end of World War II, Eleanor took up the cause of the United Nations to ensure worldwide peace, security, and human welfare. Many were doubtful about a second international effort to keep the world at peace after the League of Nations had failed. But Eleanor promoted FDR's idea of the UN. The purpose of the first conference of the United Nations was to draft a charter outlining the goals, membership, and governance structure of the new alliance. Eleanor saw the UN as a place where anything which troubles the world can be brought out and aired, and an organization that might be our only hope of avoiding future wars. The fundamental principles of civilization and the issues of human liberty were the guiding beliefs of the new organization. Eleanor hoped the public would actively support this last and best hope for our civilization. She, and this is a quote that she had when she was working in the UN, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere." FDR's successor, President Harry Truman, wanted to appoint Eleanor in the field of foreign affairs. He told her she was now the First Lady of the world. In early December 1945, Truman asked her to join the first delegation of the United Nations, meeting in London in January 1946. She protested that she had no experience in foreign affairs or international meetings, but she finally accepted with fear and trembling. Her nomination had to be approved by the Senate, but many senators had skepticism and jealousy over the attention that she got. Finally, she was approved with only one dissenting vote. The public was thrilled to have Eleanor as their United Nations representative. 5 Americans were appointed: Secretary of State James Burns, U.S. Representative on the Security Council Edward Stellenius Jr., Senate Committee on Foreign Relations Tom Connolly, and Representatives of Senate Foreign Relations Arthur Vandenberg, with Eleanor being the only woman and non-politician. Once on the committee, Eleanor didn't always agree with President Truman. At one point, she offered her resignation over the trusteeship of the U.S. over Israel. Here we are 75 years later. She disagreed with Truman over Palestine and increased deference to military consideration in formulating American policy. She thought the United Nations should have been consulted before the U.S. recognized the State of Israel. As a UN delegate, she couldn't openly criticize Truman's administration, but Truman implored her not to resign. And so, like I said, we still have some of the same issues all these years later. The first meeting of the United Nations confirmed Eleanor's view that the senators were an egotistical breed. She stated in Albert Hall, "We must be willing to learn the lesson that cooperation may imply compromise." She later said, I know, she later said, "The mission of the United Nations is to first consider the rights of man. The way to do that is to find words that everyone would accept. Questions we were dealing with were of the greatest importance to our country's position in the world, and they should not be approached from a partisan point of view." She insisted that dissenting views must be heard. The world cannot be understood from a single point of view. The test of democracy and civilization is to treat with fairness the individual's right to self-expression, even when you can neither understand nor approve it. You still have to listen. The United Nations proposed an economic and social Can you hear it now?
Yeah, I can hear it.
Okay, maybe it was just
Okay.
All right.
It's not easy being green.
I know, it's not easy being green. All right, let me know if that happens again, and I'll, change my clothes. Yeah. Okay. Truman appointed Eleanor for a 4-year term on the Human Rights Commission to draft a document defining those human rights. But there was some hostility to her appointment as a UN delegate. So she was assigned to the startup Committee 3 to deal with humanitarian, social, educational, and cultural matters. It was thought by the male delegates that she could do little harm there, as it was supposedly uncontroversial and of little consequence. She stated, "I was the only woman on the delegation and not very welcome. If I failed as an individual, all women failed." Several of the American delegates felt she couldn't do too much harm there, but Committee 3 became much more important than had been expected, a hotbed of East-West conflict. She was elected chair because of her diplomatic skills, determination, enthusiasm, and energy, and her fluency in French and English. In March 1946, Eleanor declared, "As a delegate to the UN, I will have to abide by whatever rules are set up within our delegation to govern procedures. I will try to represent the people and work for what I think represents the major good of the world as a whole. I believe that the good of all people in the future must be paramount. For us to live free and happy, full knowledge for the people is the only way that we as a democracy can be truly representative of the will of the people." Committee 3 met 81 times and proposed 70 amendments. At times, Eleanor felt constrained by the State Department protocol and advice, and was less free to speak out than she had hoped to be. She tried to preserve harmony within the committee, but confronted roadblocks, especially with the Russians. She used compromise whenever possible to hold the coalition together. Committee 3 was a sharp group of negotiators and power politics. Their first order of business was to handle Europe's 1 million war refugees. Remember, this is right after World War II. European refugees could settle where they wished, but the Soviet Union wanted to force them back home. Many of the committee's delegates were intimidated by the Russian delegate, Andrei Vyshinsky. He was the fiercest litigator, diplomat, and chief prosecutor of Russia. Eleanor debated with him in the General Assembly. The Soviet Union delayed the vote until 1:00 a.m., hoping the Allies would leave. But Eleanor's proposal to give all refugees their freedom won the vote. It was a small victory for the United States, but a huge victory for Eleanor. She had established herself as a tough negotiator, able to stand up to the Soviets. So on the left is John Foster Dulles and Eleanor, and next to her is George Marshall, General Marshall. John Foster Dulles told her, "I thought it was terrible that you were appointed, but now I think your work here has been fine." Arthur Vandenberg said, "I take back everything I ever said about her, and believe me, it's been plenty." Yeah. Eleanor returned to New York as a superstar with favorable press. She said, "I had a sincere desire to understand the problems of the rest of the world and our relationship to them. I felt a real goodwill for people throughout the world, a hope I shall be able to build a sense of personal trust and friendship with my co-workers." Eleanor's philosophy of human rights guided her work on Committee 3. She was a perfect candidate for the committee and she believed that trampling human rights was the underlying cause of the Nazi catastrophe. And the only way to fight Nazism and fascism was through democracy. She felt that democracy and the United Nations were the best defenses against communism, as the United States was on the brink of the Cold War. The next meeting of Committee 3 met in January 1947. This Commission on Human Rights consisted of 18 members, 13 on a rotating basis by geographical location, and 5 permanent members, the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and China. The committee was assigned to drafting 2 documents, a Declaration of Principles and a binding treaty of law or covenants. So they had 2 jobs to do: come up with like a constitution and then some treaties that they could negotiate with each country. Eleanor wanted to pass the Declaration of Principles first because she believed that having economic, social, and cultural goals did not imply an obligation for the government action of the covenant, but she was outvoted. She had wholehearted support for the basic principles of rights, but others wanted a covenant at the same time as the Declaration. So she wanted like a Bill of Rights, and they wanted laws. But their committee had to work on both of those. Eleanor worried that the U.S. Congress would not ratify a treaty of covenants. George C. Marshall agreed with her when he said, "A covenant is a binding agreement. It must conform to the Constitution and laws of the country that ratify it." And he knew how difficult that was going to be. The delegates worked on 2 covenants, one for social and economic rights and one for political and civil rights. Eleanor considered the Declaration of Human Rights as the first step to negotiate the covenants. She hoped to ratify binding covenants that would end the Cold War. So I'm going to tell you kind of what happened after that with those covenants, because many things happened way after Eleanor left the committee. Eleanor was right. After she left the committee, the Human Rights Committee was still in session in 1952, still trying to reach agreement on the 2 covenants. She left the last session in June 1952. It took until 1966, 14 years later, to ratify the International Civil and Political Rights Covenant and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Civil Rights. President Carter signed them in 1977. So they started in 52, and it took, and President George Bush Sr. and the Senate signed them in 1992. So she was right. Work on the Universal Declaration first, and then work on the laws. The European conventions formed a commission to hear complaints and a court to adjust them, and the covenants entered into many constitutions and court decisions in later years. It turned out that Eleanor was wise to push the committee to establish the Universal Declaration of Human Rights first as a foundation for the covenants to follow. Okay, now back to Committee 3. By the conclusion of the committee work in 1947, the delegates had prepared a bill acceptable to the 55 members of the United Nations. The bill consisted of a Declaration of Principles and a tentative outline for the 2 covenants. They presented to the General Assembly on September 18, 1947. General Marshall praised Eleanor for her splendid work on the committee and thanked her for her most intelligent, cooperative, and effective assistance. I'm going to get a little drink. Excuse me. Eleanor's biggest problem was dealing with the Russians on the committee. There were skeptics of her ability to be tough enough to stand up to the Russians because of her lack of experience. The 1947 assembly showed her that Russia saw her as weak rather than friendly. But she continued to say, we must work together. Eleanor held her own, defending her need for a Bill of Rights for the UN. She stated, the Soviet Union likes greater emphasis on the authority of the state, and the United States wants rights of the individual. So here we are, very far apart. She believed her goodwill and readiness to compromise would be reciprocated. She bent over backwards to compromise and show the Russians she was willing to meet them halfway. She said, I am willing to compromise, but the Soviets see this as evidence of weakness rather than a gesture of goodwill. The Russians denounced her as a hypocritical servant of capitalism. When she clashed several times with Andrei Vyshinsky, she found that drafting a resolution acceptable to the Russians was impossible. At the General Assembly in Paris, she stated, the Russians attack verbally in every committee. Their attitude is discouraging. It will be long and patient work to get real understanding with the Soviet government. In 1948, the Soviet Union delegate, A.P. Pavlov, said the declaration must define the citizen's duty to the state. But Eleanor claimed the declaration has duties the state owes to the individual. They hotly debated the roles and responsibilities of the individual and the state, but never reached agreement. Eleanor said, Dr. Pavlov berated me and attacked my stand. They were rigid and they distorted facts. They were stubborn and unfriendly to Western ideas, but we Americans refused to show unfriendliness. We wanted to negotiate effectively with them. Eleanor believed that with patience, firmness, and a willingness to look at the Russian economy and security needs, a harmony of interests could be achieved. Maxim Litvinov, W.M. Molotov, and Dr. Alexei Pavlov needed to prove that they were faithful communists, so they attacked the United States. Eleanor told them they were hitting below the belt. The declaration was a document for all nations, and she wanted buy-in from everyone. But in the end, the Soviets abstained from voting, which confirmed her difficulty with working with them. She stated, real communication was impossible, no matter how hard I tried. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a declaration of human rights and freedoms for all people of all nations. Under Eleanor's direction, the group came up with the words, equal in dignity and rights, endowed with reason and conscience, and a spirit of brotherhood. She wanted individuals to have rights that are guarded in any society. The first article of the Declaration was based on the American Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. The writers substituted all people are created equal and are born free and equal instead of created equal to remove the spiritual connotations. The committee wanted equal protection against discrimination, arrest, slavery, punishment, and equal opportunity, a fair trial, privacy, residence, movement, political asylum, marriage, and the right to own property, all of the rights that we have that many countries did not have. They wanted freedom of thought, conscience, religion, opinions, speech, assembly, and participation in government. The Declaration was based on John Locke's natural rights, the rights of individuals, and the sovereignty of the people, not the government. The original document was approved 13-4 on December 1947, even though Eleanor felt the language was too professorial and lawyer-like. She wanted it to be understood by all people with a shorter text. And you can see the text is on the board over there, and it's quite long. She wanted it to just be very concise, but you know politicians, they like to write. The subcommittee met in Geneva and finished writing the declaration on December 17, 1947. The committee members considered Eleanor a slave driver, but after 85 meetings, the declaration was finally approved and ready for submission. They hoped it would be accepted by Committee 3 in the autumn of 1948 and ready to take to the UN General Assembly. In the 1948 General Assembly, when Russia's blockade of Berlin made Europeans jittery, Eleanor's presence in Paris reassured people and helped counteract the communist effort to portray the United States as a money-grubbing, atom bomb brandishing, imperialistic nation bent on war. Committee 3 saw the declaration as an antidote to Nazism, fascism, and communism. Eleanor spoke to the General Assembly on December 10, 1948. She said, "The Four Freedoms speech given by FDR inspired much of my thought and language in this final declaration." She hoped it would become the international Magna Carta of all people everywhere. It is the aspiration to lift people everywhere to a higher standard of life and a greater enjoyment of freedom. The ideal and fact of freedom, not technology, are the true distinguishing marks of our civilization. I love that about technology. You can see, here's the declaration in Spanish. The declaration needed a 2/3 vote by the General Assembly to be accepted. The final vote took place on December 10th, 1948 at 3:00 a.m. in Paris. It was a long job finished, and Eleanor received a standing ovation. The Declaration and Covenants became the International Bill of Human Rights. It was translated into every language of the countries in the United Nations. After its ratification, Eleanor stressed the importance of the document as a standard for implementing international human rights agendas. Pope John XXIII called it an act of the highest importance, an important step for the world community. In 1951, Charles Malik of Lebanon, the new chair of the committee, stated, "I believe the Human Rights Commission was one of the most important parts of the foundation of the United Nations to build a peaceful world." Eleanor continued her work as a United States delegate to the United Nations. She served her last session of the General Assembly in Paris from the fall of 1951 to February 1952. Her last speech was a cry for the political rights and leadership of women. Her appointment automatically ceased with the adjournment of the General Assembly in December 1952. At the end of each session, all the American delegates resigned and let the president choose the next representatives. She seemed a natural choice for President-elect Eisenhower to continue her work. Bernard Baruch of the War Advisory Board told her, "You have as much experience as anyone dealing with the Russians." For political reasons, Ike did not reappoint her, and Henry Cabot Lodge took her place. From different political administration. From 1953 to 1962, she volunteered with the American Association of the United Nations, spreading the message of peace around the country. On March 27, 1958, the 10th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor spoke at the United Nations. She said, "Universal human rights begin in small places, by individual persons. Every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, and equal dignity without discrimination." Adlai Stevenson, U.S. Representative to the United Nations, nominated Eleanor for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1961. In 1962, John F. Kennedy seconded her nomination. 28 distinguished citizens from around the world wrote letters in her favor, including British Prime Minister Clement Attlee and President of the UN Committee on Human Rights, Rene Cassin. Truman wrote, "If she didn't earn it, then no one else has." Henry Kissinger said that she was one of the greatest human beings of our time. She stood for peace and international understanding. Eleanor died in 1962. According to the rules of the Nobel Prize, it could not be awarded to someone deceased. But her supporters argued that she was nominated prior to her death. That year, 1965, the Nobel Prize went to UNICEF, which is the United Nations committee. In 1968, her co-worker, Rene Cassin, was awarded the prize. The UN Rights Prize was awarded to Eleanor posthumously. Eleanor chose to believe in the innate goodness of humanity. She said, "The American people can meet any challenge if they have the knowledge and leadership and the ideals of freedom and democracy." Richard S. Winslow, Secretary General of the UN, told her, "You will stand as the finest symbol of all that is best in the United Nations and as the finest type of civic leader, public servant, and working colleague." Reporter Mike Wallace said of her, "The better acquainted I became, the more my admiration for Mrs. Roosevelt grew. I admired her gently phrased, but nonetheless steely determination to oppose the politics of fear, to fight for civil liberties and civil rights, to bridge opposites by forging partnerships. Her activism angered hot-headed American conservatives so intensely that the Ku Klux Klan put a bounty on her." And that was true. They would follow her around. Yeah. Eleanor said, "As for accomplishments, I just did what I had to do as things came along. I got the most satisfaction from my work with the UN. There I was part of the second greatest experiment to bring countries together and get them to work for a peaceful atmosphere in the world. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights remains the most significant document drafted in the name of human rights. Her brilliant diplomacy, imagination, and faith helped her ensure its passage. In June 1952, she stated, "My most thrilling experience was the final adoption of the Declaration, which is the culmination of very hard work and international development. I consider it my most important task." And then Eleanor's work on the UN was commemorated on a U.S. quarter just last year on July 8th, 2023. And her statue and her work on the UN is part of the FDR Memorial in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Please, if you have any.
It was kind of long, but you know, she was such, what a woman. Yes.
Was there any information about the Chinese delegate?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, and I had to cut that out. I wish I would have brought my other notes. But apparently, I forget what his name was. He debated with her, and he wanted to talk about philosophy. So he was talking about Thomas Aquinas and Confucius, and he was bringing in all of these different intellectual and philosophical ideas that he wanted to put in. And she said, I was in over my head. I could not understand what he was talking about. It was very lofty and, yeah. So he wanted more, he didn't want it so much Western philosophy. He wanted more Eastern philosophy involved in it. So, yeah. But they had quite a few discussions, yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Do you have the mic? Mike?
Mike? Do you want this mic? Do you want this mic?
Okay. All right, with your forbearance, that was wonderful.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.
Those Marines.
As a United
I know, they really know how to wow the women.
As a United States Marine, I'd like to read you my favorite quotation of Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor and Franklin's son served in the Marine Corps as an officer in the Pacific Theater during World War II. I believe that was Jimmy Roosevelt. She made a tour of the Pacific Theater to visit the Marines and the Army and the Navy. And here's what she said in a press briefing. The Marines I have seen around the world have the cleanest bodies. She could be earthy. The Marines I have seen around the world have the cleanest bodies, the filthiest minds, the highest morale, and the lowest morals of any group of animals I have ever seen. Thank God for the United States Marine Corps.
Thank you. That sounds just like her. I mean, she had to clean up her act for the UN, but off the record, yeah, that sounds just like her. Yeah, that's funny. Any questions? Yes.
Was she officially the U.S. representative to the United Nations?
Yeah.
Under
No. Under Truman. And then when he left office and Eisenhower came in, Eisenhower did not reappoint her. But she was the first U.S. delegate to the UN. Yeah.
But she did not serve during the UN during the 1960s?
No.
Okay.
No. She left in 1952, and that was, yeah. But, Kennedy did nominate her for the Nobel Prize. Yes.
So, I think you said it was Henry Cabot Lodge that was sent in her place.
Uh-huh.
And was that a political, was that a personal viewpoint?
Well, the president gets to pick the delegates to the UN.
Okay.
And so, so he picked Henry Cabot Lodge. I picked Henry Cabot Lodge instead of Eleanor. So political, whatever, I mean, there's a lot of politics, But it's an appointment. It's not an election or anything. It's an appointment by the president, yeah, to represent the country, so, yeah.
Well, Colleen, I'd like to present you, I know you probably have more of these, one of our, again, challenge
thank
kinds,
you
our new
so
ones, but to
much.
recognize
Thank
the
you so
marvelous
much.
presentations you
Thank
give
you.
to us.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Wasn't too long.